Hello, my name is Dylan Alter. I am an ADHD coach at neuroqueer.org and also at my private coaching business, alternativeadhd.com. I am non binary, neurodivergent. I have Jewish and Choctaw background, and I was only diagnosed in my mid 30s. And building community around neurodivergent queer space is the best thing that's ever happened to me.
Well, Dylan, thank you so much for joining me on Refocused with Lindsay, Guentzel, a part of this very special ADHD Awareness Month project, 31 stories in 31 days. And I am so excited to hear a little bit more about yours.
Gosh, thank you, thank you. I'm so honored to be included in this, and I just really want to applaud this project that you're doing. I think it's so important to get those stories from all the areas of the ADHD community. We haven't always had that, and we've had this sort of revolution of ADHD awareness with the pandemic. But so many of us are still very isolated in that experience, unless we're on Instagram or TikTok. And I think sharing those stories of what it's like does so much to normalize, what we experience personally, in our own minds and those, emotional roller coasters. So I just want to say thank you for doing this project.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm sure you can relate to the fact that when the idea popped into my head, it was just like, yes, this is it. 31 stories in 31 days. It's a little crazy. It's very ADHD, but the whole point of it is to raise awareness. And what we know now is how different ADHD is for every single person. And I think this is a great way to, like you said, connect people who are missing that connection to somebody who lives life like them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yes, 31 interviews in 31 days is absolutely one of those ADHD. Sure, I'll move the mountain. And if you find that you need cheerleading, let me
I
know.
love it. I love it. Thank you. Well, why don't we get started talking about your own diagnosis and when you were diagnosed and what that looked like and what initially sparked that conversation for you?
Sure, yeah. For me, like so many folks who are diagnosed later in life, it's an unbelievable hurdle to get diagnosed with ADHD. It requires a lot of privilege. I think that there's sort of a deep irony at how much executive function it takes to be able to access a diagnosis. um, I went in initially. ADHD was not on my radar. I had no idea that that was a thing that was a factor for me. I went in because of depression. I dealt with depression for about a decade, been in treatment for depression, been in therapy, really, really, working programs and support systems, and was even on depression medication, and it helped a bit, but not enough. It didn't help enough. My life was still just chaos. I felt like I was constantly in triage from one emergency to the next, and meanwhile the day to day was just a dumpster fire. I was an attorney, and I was great in court and I was great in negotiations, but in the day to day management of a business, I was miserable, and failed just perpetually at those just little things that seemed like they should be easy. And I was the friend that people would call in an emergency because I would be there reliably in an emergency and could absolutely handle it. But then my inability to consistently keep up with my friends undermined and degraded those relationships and made people feel like I didn't care. And I'd tried everything I could think of to make changes in my life, and nothing worked. And so I was really in a dark place of just frustration and depression and just not knowing what to do. And went in for evaluations, and this incredibly bright clinician started asking me about my driving history, which in my teens and 20s, I had a lot of accidents, none in a long time, knock on wood. And she asked me, what my bedroom and office looked like, and I said piles, but I know where everything is in the piles. And she said the most amazing words of, has anybody ever suggested ADHD might be a factor? And it was like a bucket of water being thrown on me. Like, no, no, nobody had ever suggested those things. I was excellent in school. And often we assume that ADHD is correlated with intelligence, and there's absolutely no causal relationship whatsoever. And so that was new information and a brand new perspective. Um, I passed the evaluations for ADHD with flying colors, and turned out I am indeed on Team Squirrel. And then also had to get through the hurdles of dealing with getting medications, and dealing with providers who were not fantastic. There are a lot of hurdles, and I had a lot of privilege as a white passing and masculine and attorney raised by doctors to be able to advocate for myself. But it's horrific out there trying to manage those things. um, when I tried medication, it was a whole new world. You have that moment of like, oh my God, is this what it's like for other people? um, Go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
I just, so much of what you have said is very similar to the realizations that I had about the medicine, and realizing I had been living almost 35 years with this brain fog. I kind of describe it as, it felt like I had been living with a dryer sheet like shoved up in my forehead. And all of a sudden, I took medication. I started the medication, and on day one, it was like someone just ripped it out. And you don't know what you don't know. And I applaud you for acknowledging and realizing the privilege that comes with the fact that you were able to be diagnosed, and that you had lived a life knowing how to advocate for yourself. And it is frustrating, you go back to, everyone's diagnosis story is so different, but how wonderful for you to be in that situation where you had a clinician who asked the right questions, and who didn't just dismiss you and send you on your way with a prescription for depression medication. They took the time to kind of understand the complexities of ADHD.
Absolutely. And I do want to note here for listeners that, even with all of my privilege, I still brought a friend into that evaluation with me to help me advocate. I think it's very common to think you have to do this on your own, and that can be really intimidating and really scary. And you can bring a friend, you can bring a family member to help you advocate for yourself, to not get dismissed. And yeah, that dryer sheet that you're talking about, absolutely, just like cotton stuffed in. And then, the analogy that kept coming up for me when I was explaining it to my therapist later, um, was it felt like I'd been, herding cats all my life, just trying to get them, in order, at least know where they are, keep them out of trees and fires and all that stuff. And when I took the medication, they formed this delightful little queue and took a number.
That's a great image. Like, the description of that is a beautiful cartoon somewhere.
I'm a big fan of ADHDers metaphors. We just love the creative, uh, you know embellishments.
So, before we go any further into your ADHD story, let's talk about what you're doing now, because I know your diagnosis has played a role in the life you're living right now, and the person you are, and the work you're doing.
Sure. Thank you. Yes. Um, my diagnosis, is one of the best things that ever happened for me. It just completely changed my life, and for those who aren't put off by the hokey life wheels, if I were to do a life wheel, which I often invite my clients to do, every metric is significantly better than it was prior to my diagnosis. So once I got diagnosed and got on medication, I was lucky enough to find a therapist who specialized in ADHD. And I also started a Facebook group for friends and friends of friends with ADHD, because we have this strange, um, tendency to just sort of gravitate towards each other. If you have ADHD, it's very likely other people around you have ADHD, whether they know it or not, in addition to the genetic factors. And so in that group, more and more of my friends realized that they also had ADHD. One of them decided to become an ADHD coach and go to the ADCA school for ADHD coaches. I was so inspired that I followed suit, and we started building community for queer folk with ADHD. And that was an organization called Queer ADHD. It unfortunately, is no longer around. However, we needed to carry that space forward, that opportunity for community and connection and support and coaching. And so we've launched neuroqueer.org, which is now inclusive of ADHD and autism. And it's for adults who are LGBTQ plus and neurodiverse. And it's absolutely incredible. We offer coaching. We do, to-do lists on Mondays. We have Wednesday check-ins. We have co-working. We have STEM parties. We have educational webinars on different aspects of ADHD and autism. We have dance parties to get your dishes done. And in addition to the opportunity to get education about our neurodiversity, we've found that there's this process of being diagnosed where you have to integrate this part of your identity, and it parallels the queer experience very similarly, where for all this time, we tried to be something that we weren't, and we thought that that was the better way. And at a point you have to stop and go, okay, the world is like this, it's not made for me. I have to choose me, and I have to make a place in this world where I can be myself, that supports who I am. And of course, with ADHD, one of the most effective supports is positive niche creation. Most ADHD support does this individually through one-on-one coaching or through therapy, but every other mental health challenge, the research says that we do this better in community. And so neuroqueer.org is a place where, for many of us, for the first time, we can be in a room where we're not the weird one, where we're not too much, where we're not distracted, more than other people. And there's magic that happens in that space. There's a lot of, relief. There's a lot of grief. There's a lot of joy. The brainstorming and laughter and jokes are just world class. And we've got people from all over the world there. It's amazing. And so in that space, being able to create that community for the first time that I've been able to find anywhere, we're finding out what it looks like to create space that is neurodivergent first, that isn't based on people pleasing or learning how to act like a neurotypical, but how do we function naturally? And then what does that mean for how we can create our environment to support us?
I'm very intrigued about the dance party to get your dishes done. I might have to just start a solo club where I do that in my own kitchen. That's at the top of the list for conflicts in our household about the dishes. I am in a long-term relationship with someone who is quote unquote very neuronormal and is very good at starting at A and going all the way to Z and never getting frustrated. And so I will say, I hear dance party, I hear dishes. I haven't experienced that they go together, but I'm very excited to try it out. And I very much appreciated how honest you were about the comparisons in the parallels between ADHD and being a queer person. And as a straight white woman and all the privilege that comes along with that, that's just something that I haven't experienced. And so I'm curious if you could dive in a little bit about that balance for you and maybe some of the frustrations that come along with having to be defined by a label that society has put on you.
Sure. And, I also want to, if it's all right with you, push back a little bit, possibly on the idea that experience is entirely foreign to you, if it is. because, right now in ADHD discourse, there's so much advocacy for women in ADHD because that's been a really neglected group for so long. The focus was just on white, Western, cisgender boy children,
You can push
and
back. I am all about learning. I am all about growth. I think that that has been one of the biggest gifts of my ADHD diagnosis is knowing that, the only way to move forward in life is to keep learning. So please push back.
I one of the things that Adka pointed out was that one of the most common character strengths for ADHDers is kindness and compassion. And so any time that there's this feeling of like we don't want to step on toes, we don't want to take somebody else's experience, but we want to relate. And in neurotypical culture, there's this idea that like to relate is to take something away from someone, to take the attention away from them. And I've found that it's sort of the reverse in ADHD culture. And the more that we can relate, the more that we can humanize and understand one another, the stronger we are as individuals and as a community. And for example, one of the reasons why we didn't know that adult ADHD was a thing was because, boy children with ADHD would grow up and they'd get girlfriends and wives and secretaries who handled all of their executive function. And so the ADHD disappeared, but then they hadn't done any of the self work. So they were still emotionally volatile and they didn't know who they were. And they'd have these midlife crises.
I've never heard that explained in such a way that makes complete and total sense to me. It is, yes, you say that and you're like, yes, why haven't we realized that?
Right. Once you see it, you can't not see it.
My brain right now is just like digesting that. I just needed a moment there because it was the picture you painted is one I think so many of us can relate to, especially if we know someone. My father being one of those people. My mother ran the household. My dad went to work every single day and was very good at it because it was so structured and so scheduled. But the house ran because of my, again, quote unquote, neuronormal mother who was very good at getting things done. Oh my gosh, Dylan. Woo, mind blown.
Right. And so one of my sort of philosophies around neurodivergent and ADHD support is not just to teach and create cultural accommodations. I heard somebody describe ADHD symptomology as all of the effects of ADHD that are annoying to neurotypicals. And that's pretty much what we have on paper in the DSM-5. And there's so many other factors to ADHD that Russell Barkley is teaching us about. And so trying to figure out not just how do we people please and sort of do this drag performance of neurotypicality that leaves us feeling like we're abandoning ourselves, but figuring out, okay, like let's find out the folks that we haven't listened to very many, Black experiences of ADHD, Indigenous experiences of ADHD, queer experiences of ADHD, and we're finding just incredible aspects of this experience of brain chemistry, of our nervous systems that nobody else seems to be looking at yet.
I just want to say we've known each other for about 17 minutes, and it's so clear when you say your ADHD diagnosis is such a gift because this is what you were meant to do. It's so clear, and just the pull you have, this gravitational pull of your understanding of ADHD. I want to make that very clear right off the bat that the energy you're putting out in this space is lovely. I don't know if that's a very Midwestern way to describe it, but it's a very feel good like hug. It's very, very nice.
I appreciate that. And I feel like, nobody does like wholesome appreciation as well as the Midwesterners.
Yes.
It's so earnest.
We do wholesome very, very well. Passive aggressive, but we do love our wholesomeness.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your own experience with ADHD. And obviously, hindsight is so important in all of our own journeys, and we can look back and we can see moments that just stand out. For you, what has always been the biggest hurdle for you with your own ADHD and how it shows up in your life?
Oh, wow. Um, it's a great question. I mean, the obvious answer would be to say, becoming an attorney. I was completely undiagnosed going through, law school and the California bar exam. There was the irony that all the neurotypical kids were taking Adderall off label and I wasn't. And when I got diagnosed, there was some resentment there. I won't lie. Um, but I honestly, rather than ADHD being a hurdle for the California bar exam, I thank my hyper focus to getting me through it. My computer crashed in the first 15 minutes of 3 days of testing, and I had to handwrite it, never having practiced that. And I would bet money that if I hadn't hyper focused, I would never have gotten through it. But to be to give the deeper, more honest, slightly more vulnerable answer, um, the biggest hurdle for me has been honestly uh, dealing with the grief and the self acceptance. And there's the grief of what would it have been like, or those sort of things. But the most meaningful thing that has improved my life has been forgiving myself for how I treated myself before I knew that I had ADHD. All of that negative self-talk, all of that, why can't you just do this, or you should work harder, or all of that, putting myself down, or sort of emotionally like whipping myself with a stick to try to get myself to do things. Like I was frustrated and I was trying everything and it just didn't compute. And I thought everybody had to work that hard because, like you said at the beginning of the interview, you don't know what you don't know, which is, again, one of the great things about creating these community spaces where you can talk to other ADHDers and be like, oh, that's not just in my head, that's a thing.
I
And
just the second you said the grief and the self acceptance, it's like it brings tears to my eyes because that is something I am struggling with so hard. And I like to put on a brave face and pretend that I'm moving forward, and I am, but it's still kind of like the big old bag I'm dragging behind. It's getting lighter, it's getting easier to carry. But I'm wondering how you have worked on that because I think it's so easy to be like, yeah, I am accepting who I am and moving forward with that knowledge and giving myself grace and forgiving myself for how I treated myself. But like, that's heavy. And the fact that you're there is, I mean, amazing.
I mean, I think being queer and non-binary gives me a bit of an advantage in that of I've grappled with senses of selves that were not authentic to who I was, but were basically a trauma response. For ADHD, Russell Barkley notes that one of the most common factors for children being diagnosed is peer rejection. By the age of 12, we hear 20,000 more negative messages about our behavior from adults. And so it's makes all the sense in the world why we have rejection sensitive dysphoria, right? And across the board, we all will ignore our own deadlines, ignore our own boundaries, ignore our own alarms. But if a friend is coming over, we'll clean the whole house. And that spoke to me of a fracture in the bedrock of our trust with ourselves. Like we don't, we'll hit snooze because we don't believe that alarm really means something, because there's been this disconnect between who we are and who we think we should be. And that is very much a trans experience, but that's also, I think, a cisgender experience that gets overlooked. Cisgender people also experience gender role stress. Every man who thinks he's not man enough, every woman who thinks she's not worthy, men who feel like they have to go to the gym all the time, or have to have genitalia of a certain size, and women who are worried about body hair of this. And it's a gender role stress. It's expecting ourselves to be somebody that we're not because who we actually are doesn't feel good enough. And there's this magical thing that happens when we stop expecting ourselves to be something and instead ask ourselves for what we need. So instead of telling myself, Dylan, you have to get up at this time, you have to do this thing, you have to do these assignments and these projects, I started building relationship with myself the way I would with somebody else. Because with ADHD, we're very good at that. We're very good at offering compassion. We don't tend to tell people what to do because we know how much that hurts. You know, if you tell an ADHDer you should do something, even if we wanted to do that thing, it's now dead to us and we're walking the other direction. But if I ask myself, hey, Dylan, would you please wake up at this time? It's really important to me. Here's what it would do for me. My resistance melts. I'm like, yes, I'll hop through that hoop. No problem. Would love to. And that can create such a stronger foundation that then can be used to customize all of those tips and tricks and strategies and skills for ADHD so that they actually fit who I am. So they're not an additional burden I have to carry.
I love that idea of treating yourself the way you would treat other people, because it's spot on. The lengths I will go to make someone else happy versus what I'll do for myself. And so I'm wondering, when you're having those conversations with yourself, where you are asking something of yourself in a way that, like you said, if you set your alarm and you get up at this time, this is what it will do for me. This is how it will make me feel. Are you doing that at a specific time during the day? Do you make a list? Is it just kind of having that moment of clarity and alone time and mindfulness? Because I think of how my brain works, and I might have that conversation and then, 3 hours later it's gone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there is an aspect of ADHD that feels a little bit like some sort of like time travel detective story of like, what happened yesterday? What did I agree I would do? What did I agree I would do? Um, and of course, carving out, moments for mindfulness, uh, having, presence of mind for routines. That's a whole thing. And I caution against, giving sort of, rote instructions for these things, because it's so easy for us to people please, to play act, and then the system breaks down and we blame ourselves rather than the system. So what's worked for me is to pay attention to what I do, notice the times when I'm sitting down and I'm, numbing myself out from other stimulus with something mindless, and said choosing to have a moment to collect my thoughts, collect my sense of purpose. And I'm doing it not because I have to, but I'm doing it because it's going to make the rest of things go easier. So instead of this thing that I'm trying to remember to do, trying to force myself to do, in that sort of responsibility obligation thing, I'll write things down because then it means I don't have to carry it in my head. And I get all that extra mental space. Right. And so, my method of ADHD coaching and self-work absolutely is more of finding out how to get out of the way in the right direction, to make things easier, to make it authentic to how I function, so that I don't have to, remember a system that's going to break. I want less to hold.
I love that. And so much of what you're saying, it's like looking back and seeing the different variables that are at play when you feel your best and when you are getting out of your own way, and you're, that idea of, I know if I go to the gym, I'm going to feel great because I'm around people I enjoy. That's a part of the variable system. I'm doing a workout I enjoy. Again, another thing that you pay attention to. And so writing those things down and paying attention to where you are, what's around you, who's around you, it makes total sense. But I think it's so easy for us to just expect that where we are in life is supposed to work. And I say where we are, meaning the time, the place, the energy, the people, the environment, all of those things play such a role in how we function.
Absolutely. I find that a lot of us will sort of be deferent to our environment. We'll assume that the environment is static, we don't get to change it, and we have to, you know, do infinite permutations and manipulations internally without any help, even to the point where, many of my clients, don't feel like they have enough, power to block off time in a calendar. Because what if I'm wrong? And getting to that point where we are actually in control of our systems rather than them being in control of us, can make a lot of difference. And it requires, trying and failing and taking that as just new information. But you're exactly right. Like pom poms, going to the gym, if that's energizing, if that helps you focus, other people being around, then that's a positive environment for you. And so what would it be like if all the areas of your life, maybe they didn't all look like a gym, but felt as supportive as that, felt as comfortable, weren't as irritating as other things.
I like that you're touching a bit on kind of the systems that have been put in place, because I think sometimes we just assume that the way things are done is the way they have to be done. I talk a lot about this with like meal planning and meal prepping, because disordered eating was something that once I was diagnosed with ADHD, it kind of all came full circle. And I realized that I didn't have to live that way, that was something my brain was making up and putting on me. And I tell people, I'm like, that what people eat for breakfast was decided by somebody. You can eat whatever you want for breakfast. Does it make you feel good? Do you enjoy eating it? Does it give you fuel? Great. Is it pasta? Who cares? You know what I mean? It's this idea of like the people who set the rules, most of them aren't around any longer. Like those rules were set a really, really long time ago. So I love this idea of looking in at making them up. Make up what works for you, because wouldn't you rather thrive in that environment and be considered quirky or strange? And I know that a lot of us fear that because we spent our lives trying to get away from that. But now we have the power to just kick it to the curb.
Absolutely. And ADHDers are famous for our innovation, our experimentation, our creativity. We're not always wrong. I think one of the, building on what you said about these things that we think are real, but really, are just the way we've done things. Linear time. So many of us struggle with time awareness. That's definitely one of my biggest challenges. And linear time is a cultural construct. From my indigenous Choctaw background, I will tell you, like, tribal time, at least in Choctaw, is very different. In South American cultures that I've visited and been in, time is very different. And Einstein had ADHD. I can't think of anybody else who would look at linear time and go, I don't know, and then come up.
So I want to know, when you look at yourself and you look at how ADHD is playing a role in your life right now, how are you thriving? What's bringing you energy right now?
Oh, I mean, I have so much appreciation, and I'm so proud of and fairly shocked by how much I've been able to improve my life by learning about my ADHD, by becoming trained as a coach, by having a therapist who specializes in ADHD. That is one thing, but what gets me up in the morning every day, what gets me engaged, what I'm so passionate about, is building this neuroqueer community. This incredible thing happens when people show up where they've never felt that relaxation before. And it's incredible, and I can't wait to see all the things that we come up with in that space. And so many people just don't have access to being around other people like them. And if you think about that, that's just mind blowing. It's assumed that we all have that. And so many of us are isolated, and that's just terrible for mental health. But the energy there, and the love and the care and compassion and camaraderie that's built there amongst folks who, have been isolated. Almost all of us have social anxiety or depression, and if you ask us if we wanted to hang out with a bunch of strangers, we would ignore that text message, or that phone call. But once we're there, you can't pull us away from it. There's this feeling of belonging, this feeling of home that we've never gotten before. And I can't not fight for that. I'd like to take credit for the idea of building, that community space, but it's not my idea. Like, I learned that idea and how to build community from my queer elders, and from my, Choctaw elders, and from, other BIPOC community, the value of creating community when the rest of the world doesn't support us. Um, yeah.
And it's so interesting how we use the internet to build these communities. There's a lot of horrible things that are created and supported because of the internet. And at the same time, there's so much good that comes from them because you are able to find people that you can connect with, that you can relate to. And we wouldn't have been able to do that if we were all isolated into our own little bubbles, especially when you are someone who doesn't look or sound or think or feel like the majority of people around you.
Absolutely. I think the pandemic, ironically, was an incredible gift for ADHD community, and neurodivergent community. We were all at home. We had fewer distractions. We realized it wasn't just that we had too much on our plate. It actually was us. And we got on the internet and we started building community there in a way that hadn't really ever been done outside of, ADA, or Chad. And for the first time, we're connecting with people on TikTok all over the world, um, which we still know so little about how ADHD is different across cultures, or where it's come up in, mythology and things like that, which I find fascinating. I do have the dream of one day. I have a piece of property in Sonoma County that was, our family's farm. It burned down 2 years ago in the wildfire, which was terrible. But I will say, for a family of neurodivergents, a forest fire was a hell of a way to do spring cleaning.
I laugh because it's true. Sometimes you just wish I wish when I'm trying to clean things out, someone just come over and take it all. Because if it's out of sight, out of mind, I'll have forgotten it's even there.
There is that. There is that. I definitely get nostalgic about some things, but I think the object impermanence has helped me let that go. But I do dream of someday making a, retreat or a summer camp for ADHD adults. There are, lots of summer camps for kids, but having a place where, say we have, a shed full of all the camping equipment everybody forgot to take with them last time, and all sorts of hobbies and skill shares and things, and, a big board for what amazing idea did you have today, um, and a place where we can be in nature and just have that sort of village experience.
I love that. And someday I hope to attend. I think one thing, if we go back to the grief, I think of all the things I wish I would have done had I known what was holding me back, which was this monster in my life that was controlling so many things invisibly. It was like the puppet master, or, the Phantom of the Opera. You don't know what's there, but something's there and it's not great. And so I love this idea of a camp where we all get to go back and do the things that we wanted to do, or that maybe we now know we wanted to do. And at the time, we had no idea that that was something even within our range.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that ability for us to be curious and to engage with with new things. Um, there's indication that may be a neurological benefit to ADHD. We have this developmental delay of 30% as we get to our 30s, but that creates this increased neotency. It's a word I read but don't say often. Of increased neuroplasticity, and of course now we know that neuroplasticity extends throughout the lifespan. But I think ADHDers are always looking for new ways to do things, because we've been frustrated by things again and again. But that novelty, that creativity, that fascination is something that can be distracting, but it can also be such a gift. Because for folks that don't have that, the idea of redesigning your entire life, the way that you approach life, redesigning your identity, and building it piece by piece in an authentic way, I don't think a lot of people would sign up for that.
I think you're spot on. Yes, I've struggled with thinking of all the things I could have done, and I'm working on acknowledging that I still can do those things. I still am at a place in life where everything I've wanted to do is still completely and totally within my reach, and in fact probably is closer because of what I know now. And so it's like moving forward with my ADHD is like, I'm just going to do all of those things, and I'm going to do them in a way that actually is going to work for me. It's like accepting that.
Yeah, that's so exciting.
It is exciting, and it feels like a gift. It does, because I know that with more people being diagnosed later in life, not everyone is in that position.
Right, absolutely. But it's something that we can fight for each other to have. Like when I think about the hurdles for my diagnosis, and I think of all the folks who don't have my privilege in getting it, it makes me so angry. When I think about ADHD communities still being so white and so cisgender, and how many people are left out of that. Not just left out of that, but it's not safe for them to be there. I get such a passion to create space that can at least be an invitation to start those relationships, because I want everybody to get to have that gift, getting to prioritize play, getting to prioritize being interested in things, getting to ask ourselves to do things. I know this is your interview, but I'm very curious. Like, what are you gonna do?
Oh goodness, I mean, what list are we talking about? There's so many things that I have wanted to do, and I mean, even just having these conversations is something that I have struggled with getting out of my own way. And I don't know if it's an ADHD thing. I'm sure there's a part of it. I'm sure it's part of, you know, being a woman and growing up with a lot of self-esteem issues. And they all probably, go back to that monster. But I've never really felt like I was worthy or good enough. And so to start doing things and putting things out there without the fear of that one person who's yelling the loudest in the back of the room that I'm not supposed to be there. I think we focus so much on that one loud voice in the back, and to start accepting that we can do things that we enjoy without fear of someone not liking it. Like, isn't that so interesting when you're like, you can do things and not worry about whether someone likes it or not? Who knew?
Right. Absolutely. And, do you also find that one loud voice in the back is so much louder than all the teeny tiny little mouse voices that are like, hey, we did this thing this one time and it worked out. It was great.
Absolutely. It's the one you focus on. It's the one that sits there. It's the one you go back to. I mean, I can pull up so many moments of shame and embarrassment and, oh gosh, just like complete self-annihilation from first grade. And to know that there are people who walk around life that aren't dissecting trauma from first grade every single day of their life, it's like, I am so envious of you. That is amazing. Like you can't be mad. You're just like, gosh, that is good for you. Like, heck yes, I'm going to get there.
Yeah, I think for me it's sort of just like a that must be nice. Like I can't even comprehend.
I know. I was having that conversation once with a friend. We were talking about neurotypical people. We were actually talking about our significant others and how we were explaining to them once what anxiety felt like. And it was so strange to be having this conversation with, someone I consider very near and dear because we had just never gone there. And we were talking about having these conversations with our significant others who are neurotypical, and they had no idea what we were talking about. And what an amazing gift to not know what that feels like, to not be able to identify that pit in your stomach that we all can start feeling, and we start growing, and you're like, all I can do is say, like, good for you. Like, that is amazing. You can't even be mad. You're like, I'm not envious. Like, I just am really happy for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if that response, that like graceful, like caring, like boundaried response that you have to those folks, I wonder if that could also work, on that voice in your head that's shaming of like, I hear that you wish that went differently. I'm glad that you're advocating for something different.
Working on it. I also, too, am in therapy with someone who specializes in ADHD. And I think it's so important that we all find what works for us. And sometimes I think people think of therapy as this, very stuffy, very like Fraser Crane, sitting on a couch, lots of dark wood and books. And therapy can be whatever you want it to be. That's the thing I would want people to know, like you set the standard of what your sessions are going to be.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought that up because, I was in therapy when I was, before I was diagnosed with ADHD, and a therapist who would just sort of sit back and like let me talk. And of course, because ADHD, I can talk a blue streak forever. Um, I just sort of felt like I was on display or like a zoo animal, and they wouldn't relate. And then when I got an ADHD specialist therapist, she's engaged. She's, challenging me with questions. She's relating, with boundaries to some degree. So I know that she really understands what I mean. And it's night and day. I've made, so much more progress in, my, couple years with her than I made in, a decade with other therapists. So I think, finding a therapist that actually works for you, that you're not, people pleasing to, or just going along with, like you said earlier, because that's the way it's done, can just make a world of difference. So I'm so glad that you've got a therapist who's working with you in that, and that you're empowered to make it what you want it to be.
I want to ask you one question before I get to my final question for this conversation. And I'm hoping we can go back because one thing in the time speaking with you that I just find so powerful is how confident you are in yourself. And I'm wondering if you have ever thought or tried to pinpoint where that confidence came from, the confidence to be your authentic self.
I would like to take a lot of credit for it. I have to, admit that I am only an extrovert on TV. I am an introvert at home by myself. Um, but even before I, you know, became the current manifestation of myself, before I came out as queer, before I, explored and embraced my non-binary identity and ADHD, I never really fit in. And I think that that's something a lot of ADHDers experience, but also something that a lot of folks from oppressed identities experience. And, when you're queer, often, unlike, oppressed racial identities, you're sometimes born into a family that doesn't share the same trait. And I was always a tomboy. Like it was, I couldn't have been like, femi cis woman, no matter how much anybody paid me. And there are some very awkward photos to prove this, where I just look like a drag queen. Um, and so I just didn't really have another choice but to be me. I would try to be other things and it just didn't work at all. It didn't even get off the ground. And I think that there was something in there about trying to be something that I'm not, that would hit that rejection sensitive dysphoria of just make me feel even more misunderstood. So even if I didn't know fully who I was, doing the best I could and just accepting that I was going to be a bit discordant was just something that I couldn't really escape as a kid and growing up, and really had to settle with. And I do think that that built a lot of resilience and a lot of self-confidence, because this is just what it is. But as I've grown into myself, as I've become more of myself, I can now be grateful for those aspects, grateful that I have, less to put down, less backtracking to do. Um, yeah. And it's so much more relaxing just being yourself than trying to be, you know, yourself and however many other identities you're putting on to please other people. And you can find places where that is accepted and not just tolerated or, dealt with or managed, but fully celebrated and embraced, as corny and cheesy as it sounds. um, yeah. And, just with tying that back to ADHD, we do so much. We try so hard all of the time.
It's a lot.
It's so much. It's just efficient. Self-confidence at a certain point is just efficient.
That is such an interesting way to look at it. I have not ever heard it described that way, but you're right. It's like, it's the easiest way to go about it.
Right. All that self-doubt, it's heavy. It takes a lot of time. Just put it down. Yeah. Just walk away from it like a phone that's ringing.
But
You don't want to pick it
you've
up.
touched on so many amazing things, and I want to end by asking you, if you were to send out into the universe one message about what people should understand about ADHD, or what they should keep in mind when they're thinking about ADHD or spending time with someone who has ADHD, what is that little nugget that will help them understand it better?
In ADHD discourse, there is so much time and energy put onto, pinning down exactly what ADHD is, what executive functions are. There's over 30 different models for executive functions. Russell Barkley did a really great, lecture going through all these different models, and why they're ridiculous, and where to start on that. And there's all these things about, is it trauma? Is it, genetic? We know that it's genetic, and that, trauma also plays a part. Um, but there's still so many people in our ADHD community that we haven't gotten to ask what their experience of ADHD is like. And it doesn't really work to tell people, like, go out and be inclusive, because we don't know how yet. It takes relationship building. And so I want to invite folks to share in two of, I think, the greatest gifts of ADHD, things that give us so much compassion. And that is play and curiosity. Before trying to define it, before trying to, take up a new planner or a new calendar, or, get the dishes done all the time, especially if you're a neurotypical person trying to understand somebody in your life who you care about and love who has ADHD. Take a step back from the stress, from the pathology of it, and start with play and curiosity. You'll build trust, you'll build relationship, you'll have a better time, you'll think of questions and perspectives that you never would have considered from this narrow perspective of, like, okay, let's go through the checklist. And neuropsychological tests for ADHD, even Barkley says they're not worth much because they don't factor in situational variability. We have to see how we respond in context, in relationship. And that can't be on a worksheet. So I want to invite folks to play and be curious with each other, and figure out, what it's like. I'm waiting for somebody to come up with a podcast that's, an ADHD or somebody who's autistic and a neurotypical, and the name of the podcast is, wait, you do what?
it's 3 hours long, and it doesn't have a set schedule on when it comes out. But yes, no, I love that. I love that. Although maybe with the neurotypical, it would be scheduled. It would just, one episode would be an hour, then it would be 3 hours, and then, all over the place.
Either that, or I've been supported so much by structure in my relationships with autistic folk. There is an untapped opportunity for collaboration between ADHDers and autistic people that I am just fascinated by, and of course the folks who are dual diagnosis.
That's, yes. Again, so many of us with ADHD, that's the question, I think, is like, is there that dual diagnosis? And that is another conversation to have.
Whole other can of worms.
Dylan, I could spend all afternoon talking to you. This was such a pleasure. I am so grateful for your time and your insight, and for you sharing your gifts with us here on Refocus with Lindsay Guentzel, but for all that you're doing, putting out into the world for people with ADHD and working to build the community that you are. It's just, thank you, seriously, so much.
Thank you for inviting me so much, Lindsay. And thank you for doing this project. I really hope that there are folks out there who hear interviews across the month and are like, oh my God, I relate to that. And then have a touch point, a resource that they can connect to. And, if there are folks that, connect to this one, please find me at neuroqueer.org, reach out, send a contact. I'm here for the community.